Hi, and welcome to the Rare Business Podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm a consultant, advisor, researcher, and writer on all things related to customer service and customer experience. Through this podcast, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, and leading thinkers about what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees in this fast-moving modern age that we live in. If this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then welcome, and please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsko.com, as I've now completed over 250 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then thank you for returning, and I'll aim to do a good enough job to keep you coming back week after week. Anyway, that's enough from me right now. Let's get into the interview. So, welcome to the next edition of the Rare Business Podcast. With me today, I have Brian Hannon, who is Chief Commercial Officer at Voxpro. Hi, Brian. How are you doing?
Good, Adrian. Thank you. How are you?
I am very well, sir. Very well. So, Brian, for people that are not familiar with Voxpro, and well, obviously yourself, can you give, for the benefit of our listeners and readers, can you tell us a little bit about you and also about the work that you do?
Absolutely. So my role as Chief Commercial Officer is to drive growth for the organization globally. We operate in technology markets in Europe and the US in particular, and then operate from delivery centers that are across Asia, North America, Latin America, and Europe as well. So we've quite a broad footprint there. In terms of Voxpro, the company delivers beautiful customer experiences to companies that are changing the world, and that may sound like a byline that doesn't have much substance behind it, but ultimately we deliver scalable customer operations for organizations that are scaling incredibly quickly, and typically these are leaders within the tech markets, whether it's a sharing economy company like Airbnb, a data and information services company such as Google, or a gaming company such as SuperCell. We help them to scale incredibly quickly and manage those operations as they pivot and change and morph as they roll out new products and services as well. Ultimately, Adrian, to be honest, the company's growth, we've grown at 70% compound annual growth rate for the past 4 years, and a lot of that is driven by the underlying growth of the companies that we work with and the selection of new companies that we choose to work with as well. What we found, ultimately, we've been providing services for about 8 or 9 years into this tech market where there are scaling tech companies moving very rapidly. And we found that the traditional model of business process outsourcing, which is ultimately the industry we're in, looks to save costs or drive productivity and efficiency for more mature organizations such as your traditional telcos or utilities or financial services operations. And for companies that are at the earlier stages of their own development and working out product market fit, or they're trying new products, or they're adapting to really strong consumer demand, they need a lot more help in actually developing out new processes and their first processes rather than optimizing or driving efficiency and productivity. They also look for more of an advocacy from their consumer base because they want to grow their consumer base, they want to monetize, they want to be seen to be a company that people want to re-engage with in the future. And so there's a stronger emphasis on customer satisfaction values such as CSAT, Net Promoter Score. And so we've developed services that specifically target that niche, and also by targeting that niche so in such a focused manner, we end up solving the problems for those organizations better than any of the organizations who are doing it more broadly.
Okay.
So that's ultimately where Voxpro fits in the market.
Well, I think you've actually potentially answered my next couple of questions I was going to ask anyway, because I was going to ask you about that mission statement. So to deliver a beautiful customer experience to brands that are changing the world. I mean, that's the thing. When I kind of took a look at the website, that's the thing that kind of stood out, which is like, bong. And I was like going, yeah, that maybe sounds a little bit wishy-washy. But I think you've explained it and recovered that one, because I was going to ask you to explain that. But given that the thing that you were talking about and how you start with, you focus on tech companies that are about to grow or are growing sort of rapidly, but you talk about their approach. I mean, but actually you call them partners rather than clients. And is that because of the nature of the clients that you're taking on, and then the trajectory of the journey that you go on with them?
I think it is, Adrian. Like I think there's a bit of that. It's the nature of their organizations, and then also what we want to deliver as well. So, like the beauty part in the beautiful customer experiences is we're trying to develop emotional connections rather than something that's more rational or practical. So we're trying to really get deep into understanding what the challenges are and becoming that trusted partner for actually solving the problems. And there's a bit of symbiosis around it as well, in that those partners sometimes don't know what their challenges are, and sometimes we don't fully understand what the challenges are for us. And so we work very hard on deeply diving into the individuals within the organizations we're working with and understanding what their challenges are likely to be now, but also in the horizon view of 1, 2, 3, 4 years down the line, based on the paths of growth that they're currently on. And what I guess it's a complete difference from a buyer-supplier relationship where you have a really defined set of SLAs and you expect someone to deliver or over-deliver on those really defined SLAs. With these partners, if they define the SLAs today, it wouldn't make sense for solving their future problems, and will be too rigid to allow them to adapt to how, whether it's market demand or changes within their own organization, drives a dynamic and agile approach that they need to deliver. So we found that that's worked very well for us. It also, we've driven it right through our whole business model and go-to-market approach as well, in that we look for added value from each partner that we bring on board. So we are quite selective in terms of who we work with.
Right.
If we believe that partner that we're bringing on board would be dilutive to the value that we're adding to our set of partners now, we wouldn't actually work with them.
So does that mean that you're thinking? Well. So does that mean that you're thinking about that? Because that's what I made a note, and I was going to ask: does that mean that you don't work with anybody, but you actually look to work with somebody where you're going to either be able to add value to them, but also learn something else from them that you can then apply across the broader business?
Yes, I would agree to that. So we're looking to learn from them, but we're also looking for, let's say, our community of employees,
right,
and our community of current partners to get value from working with our organisation as well. So it's not just about Voxpro learning from other organizations, let's say whether it's an Airbnb or a Google, for example. We also want to ensure that the next partner we bring in provides some additional learning to them, whether that's in a format of a best practice session or literally coordinated dinners to allow people to facilitate discussions between each other, because there are a lot of pressure in the environments of these scaling startups, and sometimes it's difficult to get the advice that's needed, and we believe solving that piece of advice for the individuals within our partner organizations, whether it's their customer ops team or their trust and safety teams or sales teams, to provide someone else who can provide the expertise and who's lived through the challenges is beneficial as well, rather than it always being Voxpro at the center having to supply the information.
Right. And so you talk about this kind of partnership model, which is not tied to traditional BPO sort of SLAs and so on and so forth. I mean, whilst that's probably a nightmare for your risk, compliance, legal and financial kind of teams, it feels a bit more like sort of old school spit and shake and we'll do this together sort of thing, with some boundaries around the edges. So it feels like well, let's, we know that we've done this before, or and you're going to go through this, so let's go through this together. And so it feels like the trust is at the center of it rather than the SLA in many respects.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
And so it comes back to, partners select us, but we also select them, and we use a mix of data and then look genuine relationships and feeling for how the relationships working through that process. And on the data side, we look at about 15 different variables of those organizations to see whether they qualify from a data perspective, but then it really comes down to the relationships. And if we hear people talking too much about cost and productivity in initial discussions when they're at an early stage in a startup, then we begin to worry about where their priorities really lie.
Right.
And we tend to qualify them out at that point.
So now that I just wanted to change tack a little bit, and because you mentioned some of the, your amazing, I was about to say clients, but actually partners that you work with, and they include, people like Airbnb and Google. Is it Google and Nest, or Nest, which is now part of Google, and also SuperCell?
Both of those, yeah.
Okay, so Airbnb, Google, Nest, and SuperCell. I mean, to name a few. I mean, so let me ask you, because they're all very different firms, very tech-led, as you said. So Airbnb is in travel and hospitality. Google is Google. Nest is, is a connected home. SuperCell is into gaming. They're very different. But what have you learned from working from them, and how does their approach to service and experience differ, or does it not?
It's a great point. It's I guess the starting part of that is, like, all these companies are blitzscaling or have blitzscaled, and that's a term that was developed by Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, and a group and out of the Bay Area. And it's this concept of scaling so quickly to seize market share and to become the leader within the market. And that speed and stealth and decision making is the critical factor in doing that, and it can't be done without considering that the process, systems and people that you need in order to do that. So we actually adopted the blitzscaling approach ourselves. So LinkedIn did it, Amazon did it, Facebook did it. And if you research blitzscaling, you can find a lot of very interesting articles about how it happened. And like, essentially, we were about 800 employees back in 2015. So between then and now, so you're talking about 2.5 years, we've grown to well over 3,000, and we expect to be over 5,000 by the end of the year. So that's blitzscaling in a very real perspective.
Okay, wow.
What we realized, with that speed of growth, you need to be able to seize things when you sense them. So it's almost like a dynamic capabilities perspective, but we need to be incredibly agile. We need to be visionary in how we set the goals for our organizations and our people within them, so that we don't see limits where others might see limits. We're constantly trying to do things well beyond what would be a very easy approach to deliver, right? So we're always driving way up in the sky in terms of big numbers and dreaming bigger. And that's, again, it's like all big tech companies start with that kind of approach, with a real mission to deliver something that's going to make a significant difference. And then the whole culture of the organization is a critical component of ensuring that the values linked to the people, so that they're all delivering along the one journey. And we picked that up from those partners as well. And we don't necessarily absorb the full values of our partners. And like some companies think that's an approach that could be done. We think the distinctive values that we have ourselves, as well as mixing with our partners, are critical.
Right.
So one of the key ones, as an example, would be brace yourself. And the reason I mentioned that value is because it's distinctly technology oriented or startup oriented in its nature. We expect everyone to be almost thinking that something's going to be coming around the corner in the next day or two that's going to completely change what they're planning to do today, and they need to be able to adapt and reprioritize if that's necessary.
Sure.
So we learn a lot, and the constant change and constant scaling means that the organization fits a certain type of profile of person as well. And so when we're screening and bringing people in, we want to make sure that they're going to be able to enjoy themselves in that environment. It also provides additional benefits in that it obviously, by growing so quickly and so much, it provides more growth paths for people within the organization as well. And that has additional benefits for us.
Yeah. And so the other thing I wanted to say as well, because, which is interesting, and something that I'm, keeping an eye on, as it were, and something I've been thinking about for some time now, is that research shows that, we know that kind of companies are investing heavily in digital technology and improving customers' ability to self-serve and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of the tech-led companies. I mean, companies like Airbnb and Google and the SuperCells of this world, that even though they're tech companies, they also invest heavily in the human touch. Now, But there's many others that are struggling to get that human and tech balance right across different parts of the customer journey. I mean, can we learn anything from their experience and also your experience with them about how they've gone about that to get that balance right? Because it just seems to be a thing that many companies are finding it quite hard to deliver on.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge, Adrian, is just the stage that the digital approach to AI and automation and machine learning and robotic process automation, all of these different buzzwords are linking into what needs to be a more efficient technical platform for engagement with consumers. And ultimately, like, our industry is about speaking to people. Like, I'm a consumer, I contact companies. The reason I contact companies is usually because something isn't working or because I want more of something. Or I want to understand how much are there additional products that actually are of as much interest as the previous ones I was using. So, like, we all contact companies depending on the need, and depending on the need, there's maybe whether it's an emotional contact or one where there's urgency or a huge amount at stake, then you're more likely to want to speak to a human rather than a robot or an automated process. There's a lot of bots being introduced now, and I think it's fantastic for very simple transactions, and I think we've seen that work very well in many instances, whether it's on chat on an e-commerce site or you want to sort out an airline booking or whatever it may be. But what the challenge with digital transformation is it's not all there yet, and it's very difficult to implement. It's in some ways with technology companies that are quite young, they are digital natives by their nature. So they've set themselves up on platforms that are quite efficient and make it easier to roll out things that will improve the digital experience for consumers. But ultimately, like, if you look at Airbnb, for example, Airbnb want to build a whole network of people who enjoy using Airbnb and have fantastic experiences. There's a famous saying, I think, from Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb. He was saying that Paul Graham, who's a well-renowned tech expert in the Valley, he said that they should focus on getting 100 people to love them rather than 1 million people to like them. And the reason for that was the advocacy that would be driven by 100 people loving them. Sure. And so if you look and again, this is another word like beautiful again, right? So love is being brought in here rather than like. Mm-hmm. And the way that they went about doing that was ensuring that if there's an issue or a time where they want to speak to a person, there's someone available to speak to them. And another conceptual thing, I guess, in speaking Airbnb, if you walk into a hotel, you can you can speak to someone at reception, or if you're in the room, you pick up the phone, you can speak to someone in reception, or in many instances, they could be remote, but you can speak to a person. Airbnb need to also have that similar experience by being able to pick up the phone if you're outside the apartment you're planning to stay in and you can't find it, or you're at the door and the host isn't available to get you in. These are all things that they need to solve for as well. And when you're in those instances, a new city, late at night, looking for a way into the apartment, it's much better to have a human experience there to ensure that you're getting walked step by step through getting that resolved. And all these other companies look at that. So they stratify different experiences and they look at the customer journeys and where people will be in those journeys to determine where it's good to have a digital component now and maybe in the future, and where it's good to have a human component now and maybe in the future. And I think where we'll end up is a very robust augmentation of what we're currently doing now, but with more data provided by the digital experience. And that could be data which doesn't need a human interaction, or data that's being provided to an agent on the phone, for example, to feed back more valuable information to the consumer at that point.
And so do you think that there's also an element of there's a strategic element in there as well, that some of these, as you call them, digitally native companies like the Airbnbs of the world, is that they have imagined what the end looks like, and therefore are working backwards from that, and some of the legacy firms find that a bit more difficult?
I think legacy firms find it more difficult, I would agree, but I don't think that the companies that have started more recently and realize where the end's going to come. I think they've just started with a more recent set of technology stack.
Right.
And so the reason I say that is because it comes back to the Blitzscaling concept. A lot of these organizations are starting off with an idea and then they're pivoting based on customer demand into areas where they can get a bigger market or they solve the problem better. And that pivot may determine that they need to change technology or bring in new technology. But their starting point is better because the use of a platform that's been built in the last 4 or 5 years rather than one that was built on databases 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, which could be the situation with some of the bigger banks or like public sector or healthcare systems can be incredibly difficult to bring in digital transformation. And I think it's that legacy aspect of how do you link the base and underlying systems with what's an ideal world of sharing information from those through to a consumer based on rules that allow decision making to be made by an automated process rather than a person. That's an incredibly difficult thing to deliver on.
It's also kind of, I guess, hindered by the underlying economics as well. If you're a fast growth venture backed firm, then you can take on things, very different things, than you can than a more established firm can think about in terms of cash flow and hockey sticks and all that type of stuff. Their objectives are different. I mean, if you're tech led and VC funded, then it's all about growth. It's growth over profitability in the first instance, but actually, if you're a more traditional firm, it's profitability over growth in large part.
Completely, yeah. I'd agree. I think what we see a lot of the more mature companies doing is acquiring the technology or developing business units that are small and nimble and agile that can move quickly, that are separate from the core as well, to allow that change to be adopted. I think it's always a race between whether the technology company or like the digital startup can scale quick enough before the large incumbent can innovate to deliver the same solution. And that's the trade-off. And I think we'll see some very interesting battles in that space in the finance world in particular and healthcare in the coming 5 to 10 years. I think there are two big battlegrounds where we're starting to see things change, but we don't know who's going to win yet.
Sure. So I think I think that's right. I mean, whether it's acquisition or partnership, I mean, you're very much in the partnering with your customers. But I guess when you think about that, whether it's you acquire or partner, what's also kind of interesting is how do you pass learnings back and forward? Because I guess your people are doing a lot of work for some of your partners, and how does that feedback process work from your, if you like, folks on the front line feeding back to your partners so they can learn from that and build it into their product roadmaps and so on and so forth? I mean, does that work like that, or how does that work?
Yeah, there's a lot of feedback. I should actually say, Adrian, and not to go off topic, but we ourselves were acquired, and we fully understand the value of acquisition because it helps you to scale quicker. And that's one thing that helped us on our journey. We were acquired by TELUS International, and TELUS International also acquired Xaviant Technologies, which allows us now to have a digital transformation engine as well as a big footprint globally to scale quicker. And that's an important point to mention because in our journey to scale, we couldn't have done it without a bigger platform, more cash behind us, and an approach that we could layer onto. In terms of coming to the sharing of knowledge with and learnings with our partners, I think there's a few layers to that we work through. So at the actual consumer layer, we kind of have product quality insights teams with some of our partners who would find trends around particular conduct types that would be anomalies or stand out that would suggest that there's something that could be improved in the product. And those teams would then engage directly with the consumer and ask them to revisit how they came across the problem and also how do they think that problem should be solved. And that process would then be documented and be fed back into our partners to say, this is the consumer experience that created the anomaly. In their words and their mindset, this is how that particular problem could have been solved. And then we apply our, like as Voxpro would apply our view as to how that could be solved, and it's fed back into the product team. So they're getting that information on the fly. So that would be done based on anomalies. Then also what we do is we have product teams visit our centers of excellence. So we're located very near to core tech hubs. So in Dublin and Ireland, for example, there are a lot of major tech companies based here. And also in Sacramento, just outside Sacramento in Folsom, California, we have an operation which is 2 hours from the Bay Area, specifically to allow our teams to visit our partners' operations and their teams to visit us. And so, for example, with Nest, they often have up to 15 or 20 of their product team visit us in our center of excellence for a full day.
Right.
And they sit side by side with the agents. They listen into what's actually happening. And then they also ask questions of the agents, how do they resolve that? And that insight and the actual visibility of what's happening is hugely beneficial. And the other piece of learning, I guess, that we do is the concept I mentioned earlier. It's about getting the connection between organizations who one may have seen the problem before, and another may be in an earlier stage in their journey, but they both want to share their experiences and kind of pay it forward idea of solving a problem and helping now for some future benefit in karma or otherwise. But that can be as simple as a dinner, just facilitating people to speak to each other over a dinner. And we can be the people at the center of it because we're trying to facilitate that added benefit. But that may seem like a very basic thing, but it's hugely valuable for people who are like living in intense growth environments, and it gives them an outlet to actually discuss with someone who's been through it as well.
So, I mean, it seems to me, this is kind of, I guess, slightly off topic, but it seems to me that that's probably all helped by the structure of the relationship, i.e. it's not just about SLAs and things, but it's actually more about partnership and it's based on trust. Then that must facilitate that whole open feedback environment. So then, because it's, I'd imagine I've heard of situations where things don't get passed on because it doesn't fit in with an SLA. So it's all that old chestnut, what doesn't get, what gets measured gets managed sort of thing. But you're actually talking about a slightly different, relationship where actual fact it's about the relationship and not about what gets measured.
Exactly. It is. It's a difference between a relationship by email and going for dinner with people that you trust.
Yeah.
And it's as simple as that. It's a continuum of communication. The best format is face-to-face. It's even better if it's social, and it's even better if you're sharing things more openly within that environment. And that's what we focus on, is getting to that level of trust that we can have those conversations and have, like in some of those instances, do we need to be in the conversation? The answer is no. We can just help others, facilitate it, and step back out. Okay. And that adds value for everyone.
So one other thing that I wanted to ask you about, given your experience with some of these, these fast growth tech companies, is that it seems to me that many companies, and particularly tech firms, they seem to evolve their service and experience, and it goes from a place of sort of support or help and help desk to establishing a customer service team, through to they evolve it into that plus into a customer success team. I mean, have you seen your clients sort of evolve along those trajectories, or if not, how do they approach that, and what could other sort of, if you like, tech entrepreneurs, if they're sat here listening to this, or other sort of fast growth firms that are thinking about that, what can we learn from their experience about how your partners like Airbnb and Google, Nest, SuperCell, etc., how have they evolved their service, support, experience, success teams over a fast growth cycle?
For sure. So most startups, and maybe I'm slightly biased towards what happens in the Bay Area, but that kind of drives a lot of what happens in Europe as well from a philosophy perspective. But most will start lean. So typically the communication channel that's most used for CX and customer experience is either a very basic knowledge base on a website or email. And email is used because it's cheaper at the earlier stages of an organization, because email typically, when you send an email, you don't expect it to be answered within 30 seconds, whereas a phone call could be completely different, or a chat could be different. So
Sure.
they start with email and then they evolve, and counterintuitively, actually, a lot of them then evolve to voice from email, because what voice does is it gives a lot more rich value in terms of what's actually happening with their product. So this is coming back to the ability to pivot and understand market demand, and to get product quality insights into what's actually happening in the consumer mindset. So that's the reason voice is beneficial, as well as the ability to get a better advocacy measure from a voice contact. So email, voice, then it usually goes to chat, and then it evolves into whether it's a bot as the starting point for automation, and then omni-channel. But there's also a thing happening, not just a channel of communication. Companies start to get a bit more intelligent about the different types of customers that they actually have, and they begin to stratify those customers, and they start to consider the value both in how to serve those customers and also how to provide additional products to those customers. And so as they stratify the customer base, they begin to think of how do you match up the type of contact channel, the type of spend on that channel. So is it a proactive or reactive service? The more money being spent, the more proactive you want to be if you're identifying things that could be of value to that customer. And then the final piece of the jigsaw, I guess, is around specialization, so functional specialization. So at the start, everything fits into this bucket of customer support, but gradually over time, you begin to realize, no, that could be related to fraud or risk or trust and safety issues, or it could relate more to a sales aspect, such as customer success, or it could be technical rather than customer support, basic contact. So there's an evolution in terms of specializations and getting teams built out for those specializations as well. What we see from a consumer coming through the funnel themselves. So like when a consumer is acquired in some industries, it's very important at the first 0 to 90 days with that consumer on board. Let's say in software as a service companies or SaaS companies, it's critical that a consumer is actually using the service. So they're using it, they're engaged in the service, and then it's also optimized for what they need it to be used for. So there's a need for proactivity at that stage to ensure that you're getting the customers in, whether it's a company or an individual, and that they're using your service and they're growing with you and that service. Otherwise, your business model could have a lot of people who are signed up as customers, but they're not engaged, they're not using. And so the theory that valuations could be built on in terms of what monetization you could have into the future is nowhere near as robust as it would be if you had a strong customer success strategy for that onboarding and engagement at the earlier stages.
Okay, now that makes sense. So, Brian, here's a question for you. So, if I've got some leaders, entrepreneurs listening to this, and they are facing some, fast growth, scaling kind of challenges around how do they scale their service support experience, part of their team or their organization. I mean, what sort of advice, based on your experience with working with some of your partners and also as Voxpro going through this massive expansion curve that you're on right now, I mean, what would be your advice to them in order to help them set themselves up or to deal with it in a effective and efficient way?
Great question, Adrian. Apart from listening to your podcast, obviously,
hey.
that's one source of value. The number one thing I would suggest, without a shadow of a doubt, is to reach out to people who've been through the same experience before and peers within the tech community. I would do that without a shadow of a doubt. And then, there are companies like Voxpro and TELUS International and Xavient that can add value through experience as well. That don't, I think some of the hesitation companies have is that they believe by speaking to someone you're committing to future spend with them, and that's never the case.
Sure.
I think there's a very open attitude with companies who are doing things, and I'd say that across, we're in the customer experience space, but I'd say that there's tech providers that would also have had similar experiences, whether it's Zendesk or another company like Xavient or whatever. they're working with these earlier stage companies, and anyone who's in that environment and has their business model based there gets that they need to provide information and help and support through experiences they've had before. So just reach out and speak to many people, and like you'll begin to build your list of questions and that you have that need to be answered, and you'll get much more perspective on the potential solutions to those problems as well as practical experience that gives you a much more solid basis to make decisions on.
Perfect. That's really helpful. So, Brian, before I ask you my final question, I mean, is there anything that you'd like to add that we've kind of missed out? This has been a bit of a rummage around about kind of some of the things that you're going through and your experience with some of your clients. I mean, have we missed anything that's blatantly obvious that you should point out before I ask you my final question?
I think that the biggest thing, and we probably have covered it a bit, but it is decision making is very tough, particularly when you're blitzscaling. It's important to keep an eye on what your North Star is and what the vision for the business is, the mission for the business is, to help guide your decision making, but also the direction for people throughout the organization who are trying to follow that leadership. And by doing that, we've been able to keep the growth going at the pace we're going. And I think if we didn't, we'd be slipping slightly because people would start to lose the full focus on the value and reason why they joined in the first place. So I think that's probably the number one, and maybe just over communicate constantly on that North Star vision so that people see that you're still sticking to it.
Perfect. So, Brian, that brings me to my final question that I always ask at the end of these interviews, and I've done in excess of 260 of them right now over the course of the last few years. And the question is this: is there anything that you'd like to shamelessly plug?
For sure, Adrian. Like we all have to have business at the end of the day.
Indeed.
I did look. Voxpro and TELUS International, we are experts in helping organizations to scale within the tech industry, but TELUS is also in the healthcare space, the travel and hospitality space, and fast-growing tech space. And so we're there to help. We can be seen on our websites, Voxpro. If you search Voxpro or if you search TELUS International, you'll find us. And Savient as well from a technology perspective. So I appreciate the opportunity to plug, but we really are open to speaking to anyone without any commitments, and I hope that makes sense to people.
Absolutely. I mean, Brian, I think that's kind of brilliant. I will say, I'll make sure I get that all linked up and give you guys at Voxpro, which is VOXPRO, a big shout out. People just want to do a quick search for you guys. But I will say about your website, I mean, even though you might be in the sort of BPO space, but sort of in an outsourced kind of partner and the focus on fast growing kind of tech firms, you have, I must say, one of the most colorful websites and most friendly websites I've ever seen. So even on that note, you should just go and check out kind of what Voxpro is all about, because it's a joy. You land and it feels like, I don't know, it feels like a primary school art club when you're in there. It's quite marvelous.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Adrian.
But Brian, thank you for congratulations on your success. Hold on or brace yourself for the next stage, by the sounds of it. Best of luck on that, and thank you for sharing your time and your insights with us today. That's been great.
Likewise. Thanks very much, Adrian.
Well, that's it for another interview. I really hope you enjoyed it. Now, every time I complete one of these interviews, I learn something new, and I try and incorporate that new learning into my writing, my speaking, my workshops, and the consulting that I do for my clients. If you're interested, you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswimsco.com. But one final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do listen in again. All the very best.